my son asked about money before the funeral flowers had even wilted. That was the moment I realized grief does not reveal love nearly as clearly as it reveals character. The church was quiet that afternoon, the kind of quiet that feels heavy in the air like a storm waiting somewhere beyond the horizon. My husband Robert Whitmore had been buried less than an hour earlier, and the reception hall across the street was slowly filling with neighbors, relatives, and old friends who had come to pay their respects. My name is Margaret Whitmore, and I was 72 years old the day my husband of 48 years was laid to rest. I remember the scent of white lilies arranged around the room and the soft hum of polite conversation rising and falling in careful whispers. People approached me one by one offering condolences, warm handshakes, and quiet words about Robert's discipline, his integrity, and the long career he had spent building a life for our family. I nodded politely and thanked them all, though the truth was that most of their voices passed over me like distant wind. When you spend nearly half a century beside someone, the silence they leave behind becomes louder than any room full of people. I stood near the far table, holding a paper cup of coffee that had already grown cold when I noticed Daniel across the room, near the tall window. My son was speaking quietly with his wife Claire, both of them leaning close together in a conversation they clearly believed no one else could hear. But grief sharpens a person's senses in strange ways, and even across the room I caught fragments of their words. Daniel glanced briefly toward me before lowering his voice. "Dad must have had investment accounts somewhere," he said. Claire nodded slowly, her eyes moving around the room as if calculating something invisible in the air. "Margaret should not try to manage finances alone at her age," she replied softly. "It would be safer if you handled things." I lowered my eyes to the coffee cup in my hand and listened without moving. Their conversation continued for several minutes as they spoke about documents, accounts, and what steps should happen next. None of it sounded cruel exactly. It sounded practical, organized, efficient. Yet there was something about the speed of it that caught my attention. Robert had been gone for only a few hours, and already the discussion had shifted from memories to money. Claire eventually walked toward me with a sympathetic smile and placed a gentle hand on my arm. "Margaret, you must be exhausted," she said kindly. "You should not worry about the financial matters right now. Daniel can help manage everything when the time comes." Daniel joined us a moment later and nodded with quiet confidence. "Dad trusted me with a lot of things," he added. "We will go through his accounts together and make sure everything is handled properly." I looked at my son for a long moment before offering a small, grateful smile. "That is thoughtful of you," I said softly. And in that moment, I made a decision that would shape everything that followed. Because while Daniel and Claire discussed bank accounts they believed existed, neither of them knew about the one Robert had told me about only weeks earlier. An investment account he had built slowly over decades. An account worth $28 million. And as I stood there listening to my family calmly plan how they would manage a fortune they had not yet seen, I realized that sometimes the most powerful thing a person can do is say nothing at all. When Daniel and Claire finally left that evening, the house fell into a silence I had never experienced before, the kind of silence that seems to echo in every corner of a place that once held two people instead of one. I stood in the hallway for a long moment after closing the front door behind them, listening to the faint sound of the wind moving through the trees outside. Robert had always said that a house remembers the rhythm of the people who live inside it, and that night the rhythm felt broken. I walked slowly through the living room where his reading chair still faced the tall window overlooking the backyard. The lamp beside it remained exactly where he had left it 2 nights before he went to the hospital. His glasses rested on the small wooden table next to a folded newspaper, as if he might return any minute to finish the article he had started. I lowered myself into the sofa and allowed the quiet to settle around me. Grief has a strange way of sharpening certain memories while blurring others. And in that moment, I remembered Robert's voice as clearly as if he were sitting beside me. He had always been a careful man when it came to money. Discipline was one of the qualities people admired most about him. For 40 years, he woke early, reviewed market reports, and studied investment journals with the patience of someone building something slowly rather than chasing quick results. That patience had created the life Daniel grew up believing was simply normal. College tuition paid without worry. A comfortable home in a quiet neighborhood. Vacations that seemed effortless at the time. What Daniel never fully understood was how much planning stood behind those moments. The next morning sunlight crept through the kitchen window while I prepared coffee out of habit more than hunger. I had barely taken the first sip when the phone rang. Daniel's name appeared on the screen. His voice sounded steady and organized, as if the events of yesterday had already been placed into the category of things that must now be managed. He asked if I had found any of Robert's financial folders yet, and suggested that we should probably schedule a meeting with the attorney within the next few days. Claire joined the call a moment later and gently reminded me that estate paperwork can become complicated if it is delayed. I told them I would look through Robert's study later that afternoon. After the call ended, I carried my coffee down the hallway toward the room where Robert had spent countless quiet mornings working through numbers and reports. The study smelled faintly of leather and old paper, a scent that had always made the room feel serious and calm at the same time. His desk was exactly as he left it. The large oak surface held neatly arranged folders labeled in his precise handwriting. Retirement accounts, property records, insurance documents. Each folder represented years of careful preparation. I sat in his chair and ran my hand gently across the wood grain of the desk. Robert believed that preparation was a responsibility to the people you loved. But as I looked at those folders, I also remembered the quiet conversation we shared in the hospital room shortly before he passed away. His voice had been weak but determined when he told me that not everything he built was meant to be visible. There was one account he had kept separate from the others, an investment that had grown quietly over decades. $28 million. And as I sat alone in his study that morning listening to the ticking of the clock on the wall, I understood that the real purpose of that secret had nothing to do with money at all. It had everything to do with patience and with watching people closely enough to learn who they truly are. The next morning arrived with a quiet gray sky and the steady sound of wind moving through the trees behind the house. I woke earlier than usual, the way people often do after a night filled with too many thoughts and too little rest. The coffee maker hummed softly on the kitchen counter while the first light of the day slipped through the window above the sink. For a long moment, I stood there holding the warm mug in both hands and looking out at the backyard Robert had cared for every spring and summer. The garden beds still held the careful lines he had planted months earlier. Order had always mattered to him. He believed that small, consistent effort built the kind of stability that could carry a family for generations. As I finished my coffee, I walked down the hallway toward the study once again. Daniel and Claire had already begun discussing documents the night before, and I knew they would expect answers soon. The study door opened with the same soft creak it had made for years. Sunlight filtered through the tall window and fell across Robert's desk exactly the way it had the previous morning. The folders were still arranged neatly in the drawer where he left them. Retirement accounts, property records, insurance policies. Everything looked organized enough to satisfy even the most careful attorney. Yet the envelope Robert had shown me in the hospital remained safely hidden where no one else would think to look. I sat in his chair again and allowed my thoughts to return to that quiet hospital room 2 weeks earlier. Robert had been tired, but his voice carried the same calm certainty it always had when he spoke about important matters. He told me that the account inside that envelope had been built slowly over decades through investments he never discussed publicly. $28 million. I remembered the way he looked at me when he placed the envelope in my hands. There had been no fear in his expression, only trust and a strange kind of patience. He had asked me to wait before telling anyone about it. At the time, I believed he meant that the news would simply be overwhelming during a moment of grief. Sitting in the study now, I realized his reasoning had gone much deeper than that. A quiet knock on the front door interrupted my thoughts. When I opened it, Daniel stood on the porch with Claire beside him, both of them dressed neatly, as if they were arriving for an appointment rather than visiting family. Daniel greeted me warmly and asked if I had been able to locate Robert's financial documents. I stepped aside and invited them inside. Within minutes, we were back in the study with the folders spread across the desk. Daniel began reviewing each file with careful attention, while Claire read the labels and occasionally asked questions about dates or account balances. Their focus was impressive, efficient, organized. Yet as I watched them working together in the room Robert had used to build his quiet fortune, I noticed something else growing between their questions and calculations. Expectation. They were searching for numbers large enough to confirm the future they already imagined for themselves. Daniel eventually leaned back slightly and said that Robert must have done well with his investments. Claire nodded and began estimating possible totals based on the documents they had already reviewed. I listened patiently, without correcting any of their assumptions. Neither of them realized that the most important account Robert ever created was not among the folders lying open on that desk. And as I quietly folded my hands in my lap and watched their calculations grow more confident by the minute, I understood that sometimes the truth reveals itself more clearly when it is allowed to remain hidden just a little longer. Daniel and Claire remained in the study longer than I expected that afternoon. Papers were spread neatly across Robert's desk, while sunlight continued drifting slowly across the wooden floor. Daniel examined each folder carefully, as if the next page might finally reveal the number he had been hoping to see. Claire stood beside him with her notebook open, occasionally whispering questions about dates, interest rates, or possible accounts that might exist somewhere else. Their voices stayed calm and respectful, but there was a new tone beneath their politeness now. It was the tone people use when they are measuring possibilities rather than remembering someone they have lost. I sat quietly in Robert's chair watching them work while the familiar ticking of the clock on the wall filled the pauses in their conversation. Robert had always liked that clock. He once told me that the sound reminded him that time moves steadily, whether people pay attention or not. After nearly 40 minutes, Daniel closed the final folder and leaned back slightly. He explained that the documents confirmed what he expected about the retirement accounts and insurance policies, but the total value appeared smaller than he had imagined. Claire nodded thoughtfully and began estimating the numbers again in her notebook as if a different calculation might produce a different result. Daniel eventually suggested that perhaps Robert had moved some investments into private accounts that were not listed here. Claire considered the idea carefully before saying that most people keep records somewhere when they do something like that. Their conversation moved slowly through each possibility, but the longer they spoke, the clearer their disappointment became. I watched their expressions shift from quiet confidence to cautious uncertainty. Finally, Daniel stood up and looked around the room again. His eyes moved across the shelves, the drawers, and the cabinets before settling briefly on the window where the afternoon light had begun to fade. He said that perhaps they should meet with the attorney soon to confirm that nothing had been overlooked. Claire agreed and closed her notebook while offering me a reassuring smile. She explained that everything would work out and that they would help organize the estate in whatever way made life easiest for me. I thanked them for their help and stood as they gathered the papers back into neat stacks. Daniel carried the folders into the hallway, while Claire walked beside him, discussing possible next steps. When they reached the front door, Daniel paused and reminded me that they would call in a few days after speaking with the attorney. Claire added that if I needed help managing anything in the meantime, I should let them know. I smiled politely and wished them a safe drive home. The door closed softly behind them, and within seconds the quiet of the house returned once again. For a long moment I stood in the entryway, listening to the distant sound of their car leaving the driveway. Then I turned and walked slowly down the hallway toward the small cabinet in the back room where I had placed the envelope Robert gave me. The envelope remained exactly where I left it. Inside was the investment account Robert had built over decades without drawing attention to it. $28 million resting quietly behind a simple sheet of paper. I held the envelope in my hands and thought about the way Daniel and Claire had searched the study so carefully for answers that were never meant to be found there. Robert had once told me that patience reveals truths people never intend to show. As I placed the envelope back inside the cabinet and closed the door gently, I understood that the next few weeks would reveal far more about my family than any financial document ever could. I did not open the envelope again that evening. Instead, I placed it carefully back into the cabinet and returned to the quiet living room where Robert's reading chair still faced the tall window overlooking the backyard. The sun had begun to sink behind the trees, leaving a soft orange glow across the lawn he had cared for every spring. For a long moment, I simply stood there, remembering how he used to sit in that chair with a newspaper folded neatly in his hands while discussing the markets with the calm patience that defined his entire life. Robert never believed in sudden success. He believed in steady effort repeated quietly over decades. That belief had built everything Daniel assumed had always existed. The following morning, I woke earlier than usual and prepared coffee while the house remained wrapped in the same peaceful silence that had followed Robert's passing. As I carried the mug into the kitchen, the phone rang again. Daniel's name appeared on the screen. His voice sounded organized and practical, the way people speak when they are focused on solving a problem. He explained that he had been reviewing the notes he and Claire made during their visit to the study, and that he was surprised the investment totals appeared smaller than he expected. Claire joined the call a moment later and gently suggested that Robert might have maintained additional accounts somewhere outside the documents we reviewed. I listened carefully while they discussed possible explanations, occasionally asking if I had discovered any other folders or statements hidden in the house. I told them I had not. The answer seemed to settle the conversation for the moment, though I could hear the quiet uncertainty in their voices. After the call ended, I carried my coffee into the study and sat again at Robert's desk. The morning sunlight fell across the surface of the wood exactly as it had for years, while Robert reviewed charts and financial reports with the steady concentration that always impressed me. I opened the drawer slowly and looked at the familiar folders again. Retirement accounts, property records, insurance policies. Every document represented the careful structure Robert built to protect our family's future. Yet none of them held the real story of what he accomplished. That story rested quietly inside the envelope hidden elsewhere in the house, the envelope containing the investment account worth $28 million. I closed the drawer gently and leaned back in the chair while considering Robert's final words in the hospital room. He had not asked me to keep the secret forever. He had only asked me to wait until I understood the reason behind it. And now that reason was beginning to reveal itself more clearly each day. Daniel and Claire believed they had already discovered the limits of Robert's success. They believed the study had revealed everything worth knowing. What they did not realize was that the real measure of a person's character often appears when expectations quietly collapse. I sat there for a long time listening to the steady ticking of the clock on the wall, knowing that the coming weeks would slowly show me exactly how my family responded when the future they imagined began to look very different from the one Robert had actually prepared. The following week unfolded with a quiet rhythm that almost felt normal again, although I knew nothing about our situation was truly normal anymore. Each morning I woke early, brewed coffee in the same machine Robert had used for years, and sat by the kitchen window watching the backyard slowly fill with sunlight. The garden beds still held the careful rows he planted in the spring, and the maple tree near the fence had already begun turning a soft shade of red. Routine has a strange way of helping grief settle into something manageable, and I found comfort in the small habits Robert and I built together over decades. Daniel called again 2 days after his last visit. His tone was polite and steady, but there was a distance in it that had not existed before. He asked how I was feeling and whether I had given more thought to the idea of selling the house. Claire had apparently found several smaller homes closer to town that she believed would be easier for me to maintain. I thanked him for the concern and told him that I appreciated the effort he and Claire were making to help organize things. Then I explained that I was beginning to consider some changes of my own. Daniel sounded relieved when I said that. He mentioned that simplifying my living situation might make everything easier for the future. I listened quietly and told him that he might be right. Later that afternoon, I walked through the house slowly, moving from room to room the way people sometimes do when they are preparing to say goodbye to a place that once held a lifetime of memories. The living room still carried the faint scent of Robert's pipe tobacco, and his reading chair remained beside the tall window exactly where he left it. The study looked unchanged as well, the folders on the desk still neatly arranged after Daniel and Claire examined them during their visit. I stood there for a long time, remembering the many evenings Robert spent reviewing numbers under the soft light of the desk lamp, while explaining to me how patience and discipline could shape a family's future. Robert never believed wealth should be displayed loudly. He believed it should work quietly in the background while life moved forward. When I finally left the study, I walked down the hallway toward the small cabinet in the back room. Inside that cabinet rested the envelope containing the investment account Robert had trusted only to me. $28 million built slowly over decades of careful planning. I opened the cabinet and held the envelope in my hands for a moment, feeling its weight not as money but as responsibility. Robert had not asked me to protect the account forever. He had asked me to wait until I understood why it mattered. Over the past few weeks, that reason had begun to reveal itself more clearly with every conversation Daniel and Claire believed I would never question. I returned the envelope to its place and closed the cabinet gently. Then I walked back into the living room and looked once more around the quiet house that had sheltered our family for so many years. Daniel believed I was preparing to move somewhere smaller and simpler. In truth, I was preparing for something very different. Because the next decision I made was going to change the future in a way Daniel and Claire could not possibly imagine yet, and I intended to let them discover that truth at exactly the right moment. The days after my decision moved with a quiet certainty that felt very different from the uncertainty that followed Robert's passing. Outwardly, nothing seemed unusual. I still answered Daniel's calls with the same calm tone, and Claire continued offering polite suggestions about homes she believed might be easier for me to maintain. They spoke often about practicality, about simplifying life, about how a smaller place would remove responsibilities that someone my age should not have to carry alone. I listened carefully every time they spoke, thanking them for their concern and assuring them that I was thinking seriously about the future. What they did not realize was that the future had already begun to take shape in ways they could not yet imagine. One afternoon, I drove back to the lake property to walk through the house again before the final paperwork was completed. The road curved gently through tall trees before opening onto a quiet stretch of shoreline where the water reflected the afternoon sun like polished glass. The house stood slightly above the lake on a wide piece of land bordered by old oak trees and smooth stones along the water's edge. As I stepped onto the wooden porch, I felt the same calm certainty that had filled Robert's study so many times over the years. He always said the best decisions feel quiet rather than dramatic. I walked slowly through the rooms, noticing how the light entered through the wide windows and stretched across the wooden floors. The living room faced the water, and the soft sound of waves moving against the shore carried easily through the open glass doors. It was the kind of place Robert would have loved, peaceful enough for reflection, but strong enough to remind a person how large the world really is. Later that evening, Daniel called again. His voice carried the familiar mix of curiosity and concern that had become common during the past few weeks. He asked if I had made progress in finding a smaller place yet, and mentioned that Claire had located a modest townhouse not far from their neighborhood. According to Claire, it would be perfect for someone who no longer needed much space. I thanked him warmly and told him that I had already found a place that felt right for me. Daniel sounded pleased when he heard that. He asked whether the house was close to town and whether it would be easy for them to visit. I told him that it was peaceful and that he would understand why I chose it once he saw it. He laughed lightly and said that Claire would be happy to help me organize the move. After the call ended, I stood on the porch of the lake house watching the sky slowly darken over the water. In my purse, the new keys rested beside the documents confirming the purchase Robert's investment account had quietly made possible. $28 million built through patience had now opened a door Daniel and Claire never expected to exist. Yet the real moment I was waiting for had nothing to do with the house itself. It would come when they finally saw where I had moved and began asking the questions they had not thought to ask before. Because sometimes the truth does not need to announce itself loudly. Sometimes it simply waits until everyone else believes the story has already been written. I spent the next few days quietly preparing the lake house for the life I knew was beginning to unfold there. The movers had already delivered the larger furniture, but I took my time arranging the smaller things that carried meaning. Robert's books were placed carefully on the shelf beside the fireplace, and his reading chair now faced the wide window overlooking the lake. In the early mornings, the sunlight stretched across the wooden floor and filled the room with a soft golden light that reminded me of the quiet discipline Robert always admired in the natural world. Water moved steadily against the shoreline just beyond the porch, and the sound carried through the open windows like a calm breath that never rushed or faltered. Each evening, I walked slowly along the narrow path that followed the edge of the water, watching the sky change color as the sun lowered behind the trees. The peace of the place allowed me to think clearly about everything that had happened since Robert passed away. Daniel called several times during that week, always asking the same polite questions about whether I was settling into the new place comfortably. His tone remained friendly, though I noticed the curiosity in his voice growing stronger with each conversation. Claire occasionally joined the calls and asked practical questions about the size of the house, and whether the move had been difficult. I answered each question calmly, but kept my explanation simple. They both seemed to believe I had moved into a small cottage somewhere outside the city, something modest and manageable for a woman living alone. I allowed that assumption to remain untouched. One afternoon, I drove back into town to finalize a few remaining financial arrangements with Thomas Bennett. The meeting lasted less than an hour. Most of the details had already been handled through the investment account Robert built over the years. Thomas congratulated me on the purchase and assured me that the remaining balance of the account continued to grow steadily even after the cost of the property. Hearing that number spoken aloud still felt surreal in some ways, though I knew Robert would simply see it as the predictable result of decades of careful planning. After the meeting, I returned to the lake house and spent the rest of the afternoon sitting on the porch watching the wind move across the surface of the water. There was something reassuring about the rhythm of the lake. It reminded me that life continues to move forward even when the past feels impossibly close. By the time the weekend approached, I knew Daniel and Claire's curiosity had grown strong enough that they would want to visit soon. On Friday evening, Daniel called again and asked if it might be possible for them to see the house the following day. I welcomed the idea warmly and told him the drive was simple if he followed the directions I would send. After the call ended, I remained on the porch long after sunset, listening to the quiet sounds of the night settling over the water. The house behind me stood calm and steady against the darkening sky, its windows reflecting the soft lights glowing inside. I knew that the moment Daniel and Claire arrived the next day would begin revealing the truth they had not yet imagined. Because the house they believed I had chosen was not small, and the life Robert prepared for me had never been limited by the assumptions they quietly formed during those early days after his passing. Daniel and Claire arrived the following Saturday afternoon, just as the sunlight began stretching across the lake in long silver reflections. I stood on the porch watching their car slowly move down the gravel road until it stopped near the front of the house. For a moment, neither of them stepped out. I could see them sitting there, both looking at the property through the windshield as if they were trying to understand whether they had followed the directions correctly. Finally, Daniel opened the door and stepped outside, turning slowly to take in the wide porch, the tall windows, and the quiet water stretching beyond the trees. Claire followed a few seconds later, her expression shifting from curiosity to something closer to disbelief as her eyes moved from the shoreline to the size of the house behind me. They walked toward the porch together, both unusually quiet. When Daniel reached the steps, he looked at me and tried to smile, but the question he had been holding back was already visible on his face. He asked if this was really the place I had moved into. I nodded and invited them inside. The living room was bright with afternoon light, and Robert's reading chair stood beside the window exactly where I had placed it days earlier. For a moment, Daniel and Claire simply looked around the room without speaking. Then Claire quietly asked how I had managed to buy a home like this so quickly. I walked to the small table beside the chair and picked up the envelope I had brought with me from the old house. I placed it gently on the table between us. Daniel stared at it with confusion, while Claire remained very still. I explained calmly that before Robert passed away, he told me about an investment account he had been building for many years, separate from the accounts anyone else had ever seen. He wanted it to remain private until the right moment. Daniel slowly opened the envelope and read the documents inside. The silence in the room grew deeper as the number at the bottom of the page became clear. $28 million. Claire looked at Daniel, then back at me, as if the explanation they expected was still missing. Daniel finally asked why I had never mentioned any of it when they searched through the study weeks earlier. I told him that Robert had asked me to wait, and that I needed time to understand what he meant. During those weeks, I watched carefully as conversations about responsibility slowly turned into conversations about convenience, and as concern gradually became expectation. I told them that money can change circumstances, but more importantly, it reveals character. Outside the wide window, the lake moved gently under the fading light, steady and quiet just as Robert would have liked. Daniel placed the papers back into the envelope and sat down slowly in the chair across from me. Claire remained standing beside him, still looking around the room as if she were seeing an entirely different story than the one she believed had already ended. I looked at both of them and spoke the final truth Robert wanted me to understand before sharing it with anyone else. I said that grief shows you who stands beside you in difficult moments, But wealth shows you what people believe you are worth when they think the future belongs to them. And sometimes the greatest inheritance a person leaves behind is not the money they saved, but the clarity it brings to everyone who believed they already understood the whole story.